October 2025. On a rain-soaked plain in eastern Ukraine, a column of Russian tanks begins to move. Engines roar, tracks grind through the mud, and antennas bristle with anti-drone cages. To the crews inside, this is another cautious advance, a routine test of the Ukrainian line. But above the clouds, unseen eyes are already watching. Tiny FPV drones hover, silent and patient, waiting for the order to strike. Within minutes, what began as a probing maneuver will turn into a textbook example of modern warfare where steel meets signal, and million-dollar machines fall to devices that cost less than a rifle. What happened next would redefine how both armies fight and how the world views the future of armored war. At first light, a Russian mechanized group rolled out toward the Ukrainian defensive line. A handful of main battle tanks, accompanied by BMP infantry fighting vehicles, crept forward, carefully advancing under the assumption that their anti-drone cages and electronic countermeasures would nullify any aerial threat. Their mission, a reconnaissance in force designed to test how solid Ukraine's defense really is. Behind the line, Ukrainian drone operators had been watching for hours. They knew this formation was approaching. While the Russian crews maintained formation and moved with classic armored discipline, the Ukrainian teams were hidden, unmoved, ready with first-person view FPV drones on standby. Instead of waiting to be engaged, the Ukrainian doctrine had shifted. It intended to ambush. Pre-positioned FPV units were poised to strike before the Russian vehicles entered full firing range. This change signaled a deeper evolution in how the fighting on the ground is organized. The contrast between the two forces could not have been sharper. On one side, heavy armor moving with track rumble, hoping to rely on steel, speed, and firepower. On the other side, small unmanned machines guided by remote pilots, perched in hidden locations, ready to pounce the moment the target showed itself. Ukraine's purpose was clear. Let the tank and BMP column walk into a zone they thought safe, then strike precisely. Since early 2023, Kyiv has ramped up its efforts in producing low-cost FPV drones and incorporating them into its tactical mix. In this operational setup, the Russian spear point moved forward under the assumption of superiority. The BMPs likely provided infantry cover, the tanks offered armored punch, and the anti-drone systems gave confidence that the sky overhead was no longer a simple path for attacker drones. Yet that confidence may have proved misplaced. The Ukrainian operators had already locked target details, awaiting only a moment of exposure. The terrain, timing, and overhead conditions had been evaluated. The Russians, in advancing, exposed a flank or axis of advance that Ukraine had anticipated. The Ukrainian strategy did not rely purely on reaction. Instead of simply meeting the Russian force as it arrived, the drone teams aimed to shape the battlefield by pre-targeting likely avenues of advance, mapping strong points of the Russian column, and aligning both the FPV attacks and artillery support options ahead of time. The Ukrainian defenders established a kill chain before the first shot was fired. This setup meant that once the lead vehicle entered view, multiple systems could act in concert: drones overhead, artillery on call, comms ready. For the Russian crews, each meter of advance brought incrementally higher risk. Their anti-drone cages may have provided some protection against certain drones, but the operational assumption that ground armor could dominate the field was increasingly outdated. As the Ukrainian forces had shown elsewhere, FPV drones are not necessarily silver bullets, but when combined with surveillance, planning, and artillery coordination, they become a force multiplier. At the moment when the lead vehicle reached the open ground, the trap was set. Ukrainian drone teams moved from monitoring to attack posture. The tension built as the Russian column entered zone of engagement without full awareness that its advance had been mapped and its timing anticipated. The assault that followed would demonstrate how modern armored operations may be vulnerable to smaller, cheaper, but well-integrated unmanned systems. When the lead vehicle crossed into open ground, the trap was sprung and the first drone took flight. At 0032 in the event timeline, the first FPV drone screamed across the open ground and struck the lead armored personnel carrier, instantly halting the entire Russian column. Dust plumed around the halted vehicle, and the convoy's momentum collapsed. Nearby, a Russian main battle tank attempted to maneuver into cover, its crew slowing down, shifting direction, and trying to avoid drawing attention. Meanwhile, Ukrainian drone operators, hidden behind the front line, had already locked onto the tank's position. Wave after wave of FPV drones descended from above. The tank's anti-drone cage and electronic defenses absorbed the earliest strikes, but sensors recorded critical damage to its optics and side panels. The vehicle's defensive envelope, once considered reliable, began to crack under continuous assault. This moment shattered the assumption that heavy armor plus counter-drone systems could guarantee survival on the modern battlefield. According to analysts, the strike and halt sequence underscored how unmanned systems can disrupt traditional mechanized advances. The Russian crews found themselves forced into reactive mode. With their lead vehicle disabled, the supporting BMPs and follow-on tanks paused. The formation's cohesion dissolved as units lost their pace, and commanders faced a sudden dilemma: press on into a trap or withdraw under fire. Ukrainian operators pressed their advantage by feeding live feedback to artillery supporters. One FPV drone managed to weaken the tank's protection by repeatedly striking a vulnerable flank. Another target acquired by the drone team sent coordinates to artillery for delayed but disruptive fire. Analysts estimate that FPV drones alone succeed in destroying armored vehicles at only about 20 to 25% rate, but when linked to artillery and reconnaissance, they become far more effective. What made this strike notable was not only the success of the drones, but how the Russians responded. The tank's anti-drone device may have been active, but the drone swarm simply overwhelmed its sensor coverage by striking multiple axes. The lead vehicle's immobilization turned the armored spearhead into a static target, vulnerable to follow-on fire and psychological collapse. That transition from moving threat to sitting duck shifted the initiative to the defenders. Ukrainian strategy had anticipated this. Let the enemy advance into a prepared zone of engagement, then trigger the attack when the target is most exposed. The effect is comparable to luring a lion into a snare rather than charging it directly. For the US and English-speaking audience focused on weapons and tactics, the lesson is clear. The battlefield advantage is shifting. Heavy armor may still pack a punch, but when exposed in advance without effective drone defense or real-time reconnaissance, it becomes less of a mobile hammer and more of a sitting target. As one recent study observed, FPV drone operations cannot always guarantee high kill rates on their own. Yet when integrated with artillery and real-time intelligence, they multiply the defender's leverage. In this operation, after the initial strike on the lead armored vehicle, the Ukrainian command realized that drones alone would not finish the job. They immediately escalated into the next phase. Artillery fire called in to complement the aerial attack. The Russian column's advance had been checked, its momentum lost, and the defenders were ready to shift into the next layer of the trap. Realizing that drones alone might not finish the job, the Ukrainian commander called for artillery fire, beginning the next phase of the assault. When the lead Russian tank finally began to struggle, Ukrainian FPV operators knew the moment had arrived. They relayed its exact location to an artillery battery equipped with 152mm howitzers positioned just behind friendly lines. Within seconds, the ground around the armored beast trembled. Shells landed close enough to rattle equipment and shake crew confidence, though none struck directly. The shock effect, however, cracked the vehicle's inner defensive rhythm and set the stage for the next strike. At that point, Ukrainian drone teams intensified their activity. A fresh wave of FPV drones surged in and attacked the tank's side and rear panels, exploiting the opening made by the artillery disruption. One filled the gap in the tank's anti-drone cage protection, struck a vulnerable flank, and severed rear engine systems. The vehicle finally ground to a halt. What began as a typical armored advance quickly devolved into a static target under accurate fire. This hybrid use of unmanned systems and heavy artillery marked a turning point. Drones were no longer solo actors but precision scouts guiding massed firepower. A recent Swedish Defense Research Agency, FOI, memo on FPV usage in Ukraine called this pattern drones plus indirect fire forming layered kill chains. From the Russian perspective, the implications were stark. Their layered armor and anti-drone strategy had depended on a clear assumption that heavy vehicles could dominate if the sky was contained. Yet here, the attackers saw that even a modern tank with electronic defenses could be degraded by coordinated assault from above and long-range indirect fire. Intelligence reports indicate that Ukraine's drone artillery teams have increasingly disrupted Russian mechanized advances by converting moving threats into fixed targets. The tactical sequence unfolded like this. First, the drone inflicted visible damage to outer armor and observable systems. Then, the artillery catapulted shock and structural damage. Then, another drone strike exploited the vulnerability. Each weapon system played a distinct role but worked as one. For example, one Ukrainian FPV unit recorded a strike that disabled the rear cooling vents of a Russian tank. Minutes later, a 152mm shell exploded nearby, jarring the turret ring and reducing crew mobility. That set up a final drone attack moments later that took out the engine. Such layering meant the defender could act once but hit multiple times. Statistically, FPV drone kill rates against heavy armor remain modest. Some sources suggest that fewer than 25% of strikes on tanks succeed in total destruction. But when tied into artillery support, the effectiveness climbs dramatically. In this case, the Ukrainian team used the artillery not solely to destroy, but to degrade. The drone then finished the job. The result was a halted tank, compromised mobility, and a column whose lead vehicle no longer led. This moment carried deeper meaning beyond the battlefield. For U.S. or Allied mechanized forces studying the war, it signals that armor protection schemes must now account not just for shell fire, but for networked unmanned threats. The fact that artillery and drones were fused in real-time warns that future engagements may rely less on massed tanks and more on flexible mixtures of platforms and sensors. A recent Reuters report underscored that Ukraine plans to purchase millions of FPV drones in 2025, doubling last year's rate as part of this shift. As the tank sat immobilized, the entire Russian formation's momentum vanished. What had been a probing drive turned into a pause marked by vulnerability. The defenders used the time to reposition, resupply, and tighten the kill zone. Meanwhile, the attackers, stripped of the spear point, now faced the question of whether to press forward into a trap or withdraw. In response, Moscow ordered reinforcements heavier, faster, and led by one of its most trusted machines, the T-80. As daylight broke over the muddy field at approximately 7:10 local time, a fresh Russian armored convoy began its advance. At the head of this column rolled a T-80 main battle tank, fitted with mine-clearing plows and rollers. Its role was to breach obstacles and lead the way through a debris-strewn zone. According to U.S. Army reporting in March 2025, such vehicles are sent forward to clear mines ahead of infantry and follow-on armor. Behind this lead tank, a string of BMP infantry fighting vehicles and other support armor proceeded, confident that mine-clearing equipment and electronic defense suites would protect the formation. This tactic reflects a traditional mechanized doctrine. Send your best in first, take the risk, and once the path is open, the rest follow. On the Ukrainian side, however, intelligence and drone reconnaissance had already flagged the movement. Small unmanned aerial vehicles watched the convoy from high above tree lines and relayed live coordinates back to Ukrainian command teams. These teams then passed data directly to FPV drone pilots and artillery observers. According to reporting from the Kyiv Post on the 15th of January 2025, Ukrainian drone operators destroyed a T-80 and multiple other Russian armored vehicles in the Kharkiv region by linking reconnaissance, FPV, and fire support. Thus, the stage was set. Russia believed its leading tank, reinforced and shielded, would break through. Ukraine believed that the tank would become the trap's focal point. Shortly after the tank began to clear the obstacle field, Ukrainian reconnaissance drones locked on the lead vehicle's course and speed. The tank's mine-clearing gear churned mud, metal, and past wreckage, and its path looked safe enough at first glance. But as it advanced into a zone the defenders had chosen, the opening for an ambush appeared. At approximately 7:15, the live feed bubbled into the Ukrainian artillery command. Target identified, lead element vulnerable. Initial rounds from 152mm howitzers fell around the convoy but missed direct hits. While these shells did not score a confirmed kill, their proximity created shockwaves and increased the crew's sense of danger. At the same time, FPV drone teams hovered, prepared to exploit damage already inflicted on the vehicle's systems. One of the UAVs dove and struck the rear engine compartment of the T-80, igniting flames and smoke. The crew, reacting to the fire and damage, abandoned the vehicle. This destructive sequence was both tactical and symbolic. The T-80 tank, long regarded as a backbone of Russian armored power, had been disabled by a system costing a small fraction of the tank's value. Newsweek reported visual footage of such strikes, noting that Russia had lost hundreds of T-80s in Ukraine. What followed was chaos for the Russian formation. The lead tank's fall threw the column into indecision. The mine-clearing role now became a liability rather than an advantage. The equipment that had been designed to pave the way had exposed the formation to observation and attack. Ukrainian drones watched as the remaining vehicles hesitated in the open. Some turned back, others edged sideways. None pressed confidently ahead. Meanwhile, artillery units tightened fire onto the stalled column. The combination of reconnaissance, drone strike, and indirect fire converted a strong armored thrust into a stalled, target-rich environment for the defenders. For US-based or English-speaking analysts studying mechanized warfare, this episode offers a clear lesson. The deployment of a heavily armored vehicle with mine-clearing gear assumes control of terrain, but when reconnaissance and unmanned systems interact in real time, the risk profile changes. The tank's value and expense do not guarantee success. Vulnerability lies in the movement, the predictability of route, and the exposure to remote sensors. The fact that Ukrainian forces chose to disable the lead tank rather than engage the smaller following vehicles underscores a shift in target selection logic. Kill the spear point and the body falls apart. In sum, the Russian decision to send a T-80 equipped with mine-clearing equipment to lead the assault illustrated confidence in traditional armored doctrine. Ukraine's use of real-time reconnaissance, FPV drones, and artillery turned that decision into a trap. The lead vehicle became a focal point for defeat rather than penetration. Russia may still hold numerical armored strength, but as this engagement shows, coordination of unmanned systems and intelligence can render the spear ineffective. Yet the battle was far from over. As the smoke cleared, Russia tried to regroup, and that decision proved catastrophic. When the Russian vehicles finally turned to withdraw, the Ukrainian FPV drone teams saw the moment and acted without mercy. As the column made its exit, open terrain gave the defenders perfect visibility and fields of fire. One by one, armored vehicles became easy marks. Crews scrambled under pressure, many abandoning their machines under fire. This relentless pursuit highlighted how mobility, rather than just armor, can decide survival. According to a recent review, pairing drones with artillery allows Ukraine's forces to engage targets deep in the battlefield and exploit retreating formations. Hours later, Russia attempted a second push. More than 10 vehicles rolled forward in a new convoy to reclaim lost ground. But heavy rains had turned the soil into a trap. Tracks sank into mud, engines labored, and several tanks became stuck among wreckage from earlier fights. Meanwhile, Ukrainian reconnaissance drones hovered overhead, streaming live coordinates to artillery units that were already primed for a kill shot. The terrain itself became part of the defensive weapon-weakening movement and exposing the column to coordinated attack. As the convoy ground to a halt, a Ukrainian FPV drone scored a direct hit on the lead tank. That blow blocked the path for vehicles behind, creating a bottleneck that transformed moving armor into static targets. Artillery shells followed, striking at least 2 more vehicles with accuracy. The rest of the column collided, stalled, or burned. The hand of nature and the precision of unmanned systems combined. What should have been a coordinated advance ended as a line of burning metal caught in the same mud it sought to cross. For a US-based or English-speaking audience that studies mechanized engagements, the lesson is stark terrain and timing matter as much as firepower. Heavy armor, without secure mobility and situational awareness, can become a liability. The defenders turned what looked like a retreat into a catastrophe for the opponent. Drone teams exploited every weakness, artillery crews delivered crippling fire, and the environment sealed the fate of the assault. Statistical data on drone impact is still emerging, but some assessments suggest that small drones may have contributed to up to 70% of Russian equipment losses in key engagements. That figure may not apply directly to this case, but it underlines the shift. The balance of advantage on the battlefield is less about how many tanks you bring and more about how you use them and whether your enemy uses drones and intelligence to exploit every seam. In this final ambush phase, the pace of the battle changed. What began as an attempt to push forward deteriorated into a rout under persistent pressure. The Russians lost not just vehicles, but control of momentum and initiative. The Ukrainians, meanwhile, converted a defensive posture into dominance by orchestrating movement into kill zones, using drones to observe, artillery to strike, and terrain to trap. When the last explosion faded, the outcome was clear: Ukraine had turned defense into dominance. By nightfall, the battlefield had fallen silent. Smoke still rose over the wreckage where more than a dozen Russian tanks and BMPs now lay scattered and burning. Ukrainian troops held their positions, proving that precision and coordination can outweigh raw power. What was once a proud symbol of Russian might, the armored column had become a monument to its own limits. Reports from Reuters note that Moscow's armored losses have surged this year, showing how vulnerable heavy vehicles have become against small, intelligent weapons. This fight revealed more than a tactical failure. It showed that the future of war belongs not to mass and muscle, but to speed, data, and the silent accuracy of drones. Each strike rewritten the rules. And for Russia, each loss carried the weight of a fading empire. If you want more in-depth analyses like this, subscribe to Military Force, where every battle tells the truth behind modern power.